Hello and welcome back for another presentation in your World Regional Geography course. This presentation in particular will introduce the realm of North America. Well, let's begin. Well, North America is divided into a number of regions that each have their own unique set of landforms. As an example, the Canadian Shield, geologically, are the oldest rocks found in North America, nearly 4 billion years old. The climate distribution in North America is also incredibly diverse, everything from deserts to tundras. Climate is distributed both laterally as well as topographically. Now, let's observe this map on the right-hand side. We obviously see the continent of North America, and we're able to observe between color and patterns the different types of climates. So you can see that there's shrublands, Mediterranean scrub, savannas. We also have some of the temperate forests, the boreal, and as example, even the tropical forests down in Florida. So what's interesting about looking at this diagram as a whole is that we certainly see that this is divided laterally, but we also see that it's divided topographically in a sense. We observe that the coastal range is here. We also have the Sierra Nevada basin and ranges, the Rockies themselves, the Appalachians. So we know that there is definitely a relationship with topography and weather and climate. We also know that there's a relationship with continentality, or how close that region is to water, and also taking into consideration the temperature of that water. Well, moving forward, we can also look at really where these people came from. Now, obviously, this diagram does not take into consideration indigenous and individuals that had already been in, as an example, the United States at that time, but it's more looking at the influx of migration of where these people had come from. As you can see, major paths of early European penetration of present United States. What's interesting is that whether you understand the image or not, we can certainly reflect on the names of the regions and places that are there. As an example, you can see that there is a correlation with where the French came into the United States region itself. And think about the names of the rivers and towns and cities, Baton Rouge as an example. We also see a relationship where the Spanish had entered this region, thinking specifically in California, with the majority of our names of streets and cities, and even some of the counties, the names themselves having Spanish influence. And then we obviously, where the 13 original colonies were, we definitely have integration of English names as well as Dutch and Swedish. So this is an interesting diagram that I found that I just felt kind of brought in this name of where, not just where the people came from, which kind of leads into that idea of the melting pot, but where did the names come from that are still on our landscape today? Well, that being said, we can also observe this in looking at population density and comparing it to relief. Are the relationships where populations live as well as the relief of the landscape? And we certainly see that that's the case. We obviously see that there's quite a dense population along the East Coast, also along the West Coast. More west of the Rocky Mountains is a lot more scarce of population, but that also means, in particular, if we look at the climate classification, it's rather dry. But we're able to observe that these different types of population clusters. We'll also talk a little bit later about the Sun Belt, which is this area down here. Some people also call it the Sand Belt, being where population has increased dramatically in the last 15 years in this region, mostly because people want to live near a beach. They like that ocean living versus living in places such as Minneapolis or Winnipeg, where they have extreme winters, and it's a kind of a hard place to live versus living on a coastal spot all year round. Moving forward, let's look in specific at the U.S. early development and globalization. So beginning with the original 13 colonies, what would then transition into 50 United States, there's been incredible growth and turmoil. New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and the South are considered the cultural hearths, or places where the origin of culture spread throughout our nation. So the New England area was known for its poor soil, but rich in natural resources, that then birthed the North American Industrial Revolution, which then turned into the Steel Belt that more recently has been identified as the Rust Belt. The Mid-Atlantic region has fertile soils, rich agriculture, and robust network of towns, cities, and diversity. And then we can also look at the South, which has incredibly fertile soil but more of plantation culture. Now, that being said, if these were just kind of those hearths in which culture kind of spread throughout, what other push-pull factors happened during the westward expansion? Beyond just the ideals of manifest destiny. So I gave two examples down here: the gold rush in California, how that brought people from all over the world, not just the United States, to the West Coast, and also what about the 1930s during the Great Depression? That many of the farms were dealing with the Dust Bowl, and there wasn't work for manual labor, but California had the right climate, the right soil, and the appropriate amounts of water in those regions that also brought people forth into that hearth in its own element. Moving forward, looking at the U.S. early development globalization, we can also think about just how economy is observed in a landscape. So economic geography can be grouped into one of four of the following categories. You have the primary, secondary, tertiary, and the quaternary. So primary sectors include everything that would pertain to the collection of raw materials such as agriculture, forestry, fishing, mining, in other words, growing and extracting activities. Just kind of thinking in California alone, we have one of the largest open mine pits. It's out in Boron, where they mine borax, which is used not just for soap and for fertilizers, but it's also used as the glass in most cellular phones. Secondary economic sector involved the processing of these raw materials through manufacturing, which has been the mainstay of economic growth in most developed countries. And so just really taking those raw materials and producing it into steel or producing it into something a little bit different. The tertiary economic sectors, activities that are produced, those services, but not the physical products. So those who actually produce the service for those products, but not the products themselves. And then lastly, the quaternary economic sector are those who deal with the information collecting and processing as well as the management. So you really go from just raw material to just moving into the more database element. I've also selected two diagrams on the right that were pulled from the text, one looking at this urban-rural shift, and then also looking at the traditional urban pattern design of where you have your urban center, dairy farming, forest, grains, and livestock. And we have this very interesting formula in that sense and how we like to plan our cities for efficiency in the United States. But moving over here to the top one, that rural to urban shift, you can see that you have that rural tradition, agriculture, urban being post-industrial, informative, so being more of rural being hands-on, versus urban being more technology and more robotic in that sense for what we're dealing with. And we certainly see that there are higher incomes involved with the urban shift. We also see that family size also decreases with those in an urban shift environment versus with looking at rural. That's not to say that people who work in rural economies are not high income, but when we look at more of the spectrum of low to middle to high class. Unfortunately, when it comes to the volume of work that's done for the price, it's usually kind of found on the left-hand side. Moving forward, looking at North America's population and religion, which we kind of looked at briefly in an earlier slide, but one of the most striking shifts in immigration patterns in recent history involved the dramatic increase of Hispanic and Latino immigrants in the U.S. As of 2010, Hispanics were the largest ethnic minority in the U.S., surpassing the previous leader numbers being African American. Now, nearly 50% of all Hispanics and Latinos in the U.S. live either in California or Texas, but obviously they're observed in every state across our nation. As you can see in this little diagram that I've shown here, we can see Hispanic population by percentage, and we can see that, again, it's that Sun Belt area down here. There's obviously some in Oregon and Washington and scattered throughout other regions throughout the state, but we see that this is the prominent area in which we have a larger concentration of Hispanic and Latino immigrants. Now, the Great Migration of the blacks from the South occurred between 1910 and 1925, obviously post-Civil War, and as an example, I picked the town of Allensworth, which is founded in California. The name of the town is called Allensworth, and their slogan was founded, financed, and governed by blacks. It was in Northern California. Colonel Allen Allensworth came to California during the Great Migration to start a farming and agriculture community in Tulare, California. And so we saw this really interesting flux of people that were migrating. Obviously in this diagram here, we're showing that still the concentration is down beneath the Sun Belt in the South, but we are now seeing that there's, now we're looking at yellow versus none, that there is a diverse spread of African population in the United States, which is pretty cool. Moving forward, looking at just population compared to religion itself, we can see that there are patterns of faith throughout throughout North America, but specifically looking at the United States. So we can see that some of the prominent religions are Baptist, Catholic, Christian, Latter-day Saints, Lutheran, Mennonite, Methodist, and then Reformed, and then obviously there are some others which are mixes. And we can certainly see there are clusters within these regions of religion. We see that obviously there's a large cluster of Baptists in the South. Now we can see on the West Coast that it's predominantly Catholic. We can see that within Utah you have Latter-day Saints and so on and so forth. Lutheran up in the Midwest, northern area. So we can see there's lots of kind of relationships there. And really, I mean, just to share this slide is just to show that we do have obviously that melting pot of diversity, but we also see that there's a very interesting we do have the diversity of religion and faith in the United States, but it's still kind of in these hearths, in these realms in which you have these hubs of religion, which are pretty interesting. There could be definite studies done with this and looking at politics as well, but we don't cover politics here. Now moving into Canada, the total population of Canada as of 2011 is about 34 million people, which is still less than California alone, but still quite a population. Most of Canada is considered D climate or continental, although there are some areas in the northern realms that are E. Canada has an incredibly diverse amount of natural resources, including not just rich soils, but tremendous amounts of coal and oil, most of which are found around the Canadian Shield. The French and British have certainly had their mark on this region, as over about 58% of the population speaks English, 22% still speaks French in Canada as a whole. Now, hostility began between the French and British. That goes back to 1530s, and also continuing through the 1790s when the British Parliament ended up splitting Quebec into two pieces, the upper and lower Canadian portion of Quebec. Now, as for those native or indigenous to Canada, only about 4% of that population makes up the total population of Canada, and most of the current immigrants to Canada are from Asian countries, especially China and Southeast Asia. So they're seeing a very large flux of immigration from those countries, not from Britain or from France, which is pretty interesting. So North America regions, looking just this way, we've heard these phrases before. We looked at it in other realms, such as in Russia, but we definitely have these realms within the United States. We have the total West Coast, the Mountain West, where they're considered the Prairie Provinces, Midwest, Southwest, the South, our core or hubs area. They're identifying this core area because of the value of the megalopolis, the large, massive cities. South Canada, French Canada, Northeast, and the far north. I kind of went out of order there, but you've certainly heard of these regions and these realms, so now you kind of get a better perspective as to where they belong. So we talk about the Midwest. It's technically central, if you think about it, but versus the Mountain West and West Coast. But anyway, I think it's an interesting way to perceive these different regions. Perhaps you've been to some of these regions, so be sure to comment below if you've done that. Now let's look at some of this as a tested type value. So let's review. The first question is, Canadian territories are observing a higher immigration population coming from where? The Sun Belt is what? The next question is, where is the largest U.S. megalopolis located? And question 4 is, who is Canada's largest trade partner? So before I show the answers, don't forget to like the video, subscribe if you have not done so yet, and don't forget to comment below. So let's move into the answers. So the Canadian territories are observing a larger influx population from where? We're finding that's actually coming from Asia and Southwest Asia. The Sun Belt is a region of ever-growing information-based firms, population boom, about 88% population boom in those regions in the last 15 years, which is pretty impressive. And it's just really along the southern part of North America. Where is the largest U.S. megalopolis? Well, it's called the core. It's between D.C. and Boston. Think about just the things that are out there between institutions, meaning universities and colleges, looking at political hubs and stuff like that. And then who is Canada's largest trade partner? And believe it or not, it's actually us, the US. Nearly 80% of all of their exports actually just come straight down to here. And what's interesting is 70% of their imports come from us. So we have an incredibly great and strong relationship with Canada when it comes between imports and exports. Hope that was helpful. Don't forget to continue on because we've got a couple more realms to discuss, and we'll talk soon.